Imagine being born into a world where your body, your labor, even your very name did not belong to you. A world where you were bought and sold like livestock, beaten into silence, and told you had no worth. This was the world that Isabella Baumfree entered in 1797 in the state of New York, a land that called itself free while still enslaving its people. History would remember her by another name, Sojourner Truth. Sojourner's story is not simply one of survival. It is a story of defiance, courage, and an unshakable belief in justice. She endured brutal beatings, backbreaking labor, and the heart-wrenching pain of seeing her children torn from her arms. Yet, against all odds, she walked away from bondage, not just once, but forever, choosing freedom over fear. But Sojourner Truth's journey did not end with her escape. She transformed her pain into power, her silence into a voice that could not be ignored. Traveling across the country, she stood before crowds who doubted her, mocked her, or dismissed her as a woman and as a former slave. Yet she answered them with words so piercing, so unforgettable, that they echoed across generations. Her famous cry, "Ain't I a woman?" cut through hypocrisy and demanded that the world reckon with both slavery and women's rights. This is the story of how Sojourner Truth escaped slavery and rose to become one of the greatest voices for freedom and equality in American history. She was born in 1797 in the cold hills of Ulster County, New York, into a world that had already decided her fate. Her given name was Isabella Baumfree, though few would ever call her that with warmth. To the white families who claimed her, she was not a child to be cherished, but property to be owned, traded, and used. She spoke Dutch before she spoke English, for the first enslavers of her family were of Dutch descent, and their commands, sharp and unyielding, shaped her earliest memories. Isabella's childhood was marked not by laughter or comfort, but by loss. She was separated from her parents at a young age, sold to strangers who beat her for not understanding their language, who lashed her for every mistake in the fields or the household. Each sale tore her further from her roots, scattering siblings across farms and villages, leaving her to grow up with no anchor except the fragments of stories told in whispers at night. The cruelty of her world was relentless. She learned to endure hunger, to carry burdens twice her size, to live with wounds both on her skin and in her heart. Yet, even as a girl, she carried within her something her enslavers could not touch, a deep, burning sense that her life was meant for more. She did not yet know what form it would take, but she clung to faith, to the songs of survival murmured by those older than her, and to the fierce belief that somehow, in some way, freedom was not a dream, but a destiny. As Isabella grew, the pattern of her life became a series of sales and separations. She was passed from one household to another, each new enslaver treating her less as a human being and more as a tool to be broken in. She was still a child when she learned what it meant to be beaten for failing to understand orders given in English, a language foreign to her Dutch-speaking tongue. Whips cut into her back not because she disobeyed, but because she could not yet comprehend. The pain taught her quickly, but it also etched a quiet defiance into her heart. She watched as her siblings were sold away, one by one, until she could no longer count where they had gone or who now claimed them. The bonds of family, meant to nurture and protect, were deliberately torn apart. Loneliness became her constant companion, yet it was in this loneliness that her spirit sharpened. She learned to endure silence, to find strength in prayer, and to cling to the fragments of her mother's words, reminders that even in bondage she was still a child of God. Her young body bore the marks of labor far beyond her years. Days in the fields left her hands raw, her back bent under loads meant for grown men. Nights brought little relief, only the cold floor and the ache of exhaustion. But even as her enslavers sought to crush her spirit, Isabella discovered a resilience they could not erase. Somewhere deep within, she believed there was more than chains, more than pain, more than the cruel bargain of being bought and sold. As Isabella grew into womanhood, her life was shaped not by choice, but by command. She was forced into marriage with another enslaved man, chosen not for love, but for the convenience of those who owned them. Together, they brought children into the world, but these children were born with chains around their futures. Each birth carried both joy and sorrow, Joy at new life, sorrow at knowing that life could be torn away at any moment. The pain of motherhood under slavery was unlike any other. Isabella nursed her children, carried them on weary shoulders, and tried to shield them from the lash. Yet she knew she had no claim to them. They were counted not as her own, but as property, to be bought, sold, or taken away at a master's whim. And when the unthinkable happened, when her young son was sold illegally to a distant enslaver in Alabama, Isabella's grief turned to fire. Against all odds, she did something almost unimaginable for a black woman in the early 1800s. She took her case to court. In a system built to silence women like her, in a courtroom that barely recognized her humanity, Isabella stood and demanded justice for her child. The case was long, bitter, and fraught with the weight of prejudice. But she would not relent. Her courage and persistence prevailed. The court ruled in her favor, and her son was returned to her. It was one of the first known instances of a black woman successfully challenging a white man in an American court. For Isabella, it was more than a personal victory. It was a glimpse of her future, a life where her voice could no longer be ignored. By the mid-1820s, change was stirring in New York. The state had passed a gradual abolition law, promising that slavery would end within a few years. But Isabella knew the cruelty of enslavers. Promises meant little when greed held sway. She had been beaten too many times, seen too many families destroyed, to believe that freedom would simply be handed to her when the law demanded it. In 1826, with her infant daughter in her arms, she made the most courageous choice of her life. One morning, she walked away from the farm where she was enslaved. She had no wagon, no horse, no grand escape plan. Just the determination that her body and her child would no longer be owned. Step by step, she carried herself out of bondage, every mile a gamble, every sound behind her a potential threat of capture. Her journey led her to the home of the Van Wagenens, a Quaker family who took her in and offered her shelter. For the first time, Isabella tasted a measure of freedom. She worked for them, earned her keep, and discovered that life outside the yoke of slavery could be shaped by her own will. Though her other children were still enslaved, though her heart ached with the weight of separation, she had broken the first chain. It was not just an escape. It was a declaration. She would never return, never bow again to the whip or the auction block. Isabella had stepped into freedom, and with that step, she began to walk toward the destiny the world would one day know as Sojourner Truth. Freedom gave Isabella her body, but it was faith that gave her a mission. In the years after her escape, she worked as a servant and housekeeper, piecing together a living while carrying the scars of bondage. Yet, even as she labored, she felt a stirring within her, a call that could not be ignored. She believed God spoke directly to her, guiding her steps, whispering that her life was meant for something greater than survival. In 1843, she answered that call. She took a new name for herself, a name that was not given by enslavers, nor written in any ledger of ownership. She became Sojourner Truth. To sojourn was to travel, to journey, to walk the roads with purpose. And truth was the fire in her voice, the message she believed God commanded her to deliver. With this new name, she shed the remnants of Isabella the slave and claimed her identity as a free woman on a divine mission. Sojourner Truth began to travel from town to town, not with wealth or power, but with a voice that carried like thunder. She spoke in churches and meeting halls, sometimes welcomed, often mocked, yet never silenced. Her towering presence and unshakable conviction made her unforgettable. For every sneer or insult hurled her way, she answered with words that cut deeper than any lash. She was no longer a woman defined by chains. She was a messenger of freedom, carrying truth wherever her feet would take her. When Sojourner Truth first stood to speak, many in the audience doubted her before she even opened her mouth. She was a tall, imposing woman, her voice carrying the weight of both suffering and conviction, yet her background made her an easy target for scorn. She had never learned to read or write, and in a world where polished speeches and written pamphlets carried weight, she seemed an unlikely messenger. But the moment she began to speak, those doubts dissolved. Her words were raw, powerful, and alive with truth. She did not need books to tell her story. She carried it in her scars, in her memories, in the rhythm of her voice. She spoke of the backbreaking labor she had endured, of the children she had lost, of the iron will that had carried her out of slavery. Each sentence was testimony, each story a mirror held up to a nation that called itself free while millions remained in chains. Crowds who expected to laugh at her instead found themselves shaken. Some tried to shout her down, accusing her of lying, mocking her as a woman speaking out of place. Yet Sojourner never wavered. When hecklers jeered, she answered them with a steady gaze and words so direct that silence fell like a stone across the room. She transformed ridicule into respect, disbelief into thunderous applause. Her reputation spread quickly. Soon she was traveling from city to city, standing before abolitionist gatherings, church congregations, and women's meetings. She was not just telling her own story, she was demanding that America confront its own sins. And in her booming voice, people heard not only one woman's truth, but the voice of justice itself. In 1851, Sojourner Truth walked into a convention hall in Akron, Ohio, where a women's rights gathering was underway. The air inside was tense. The movement for women's suffrage was still young, and many of its leaders were white women who saw the vote as their own battle. Some feared that the presence of black women, especially a formerly enslaved woman, would disrupt their cause or give ammunition to critics. When Sojourner rose to speak, murmurs rippled through the hall. She was not educated, she carried no notes, and her deep, commanding voice cut through the chatter. At first, her words were simple, but each phrase carried the force of a hammer striking iron. She pointed out the hypocrisy of those who claimed women were too weak or too delicate for equality. With piercing clarity, she asked the question that would echo across centuries. Ain't I a woman? She spoke of plowing fields, of bearing children, of enduring lash and labor, of being denied the gentleness that men claimed women needed. And yet, she reminded the audience, she was still a woman, strong, enduring, and worthy of the same rights as any other. Her speech cut across both racism and sexism, uniting the fight for abolition with the fight for women's rights. The room fell silent under the weight of her words, and when she finished, the crowd erupted. The phrase became immortal, not because it was polished rhetoric, but because it was undeniable truth. In that moment, Sojourner Truth carved her place in history, not only as an abolitionist, but as one of the fiercest voices in the struggle for women's equality. When the Civil War erupted in 1861, Sojourner Truth saw it not only as a battle between North and South, but as a reckoning for the soul of the nation. She threw herself into the cause with the same fire that had carried her from slavery into freedom. Wherever she traveled, she urged black men to enlist in the Union Army, declaring that the fight was not just for the Union, but for the liberation of their people. Her voice, already a weapon, became a rallying cry for freedom on the battlefield. Sojourner also turned her efforts toward the lives of those who had already escaped slavery. She worked with relief organizations in Washington, D.C., helping freed men and women find food, shelter, and dignity in a world still reluctant to recognize their humanity. She demanded fair treatment for black soldiers, equal pay for their service, and justice for those who risked everything to wear the Union uniform. Her influence grew so great that in 1864, she was invited to the White House. There, she met President Abraham Lincoln face to face. For a woman who had once been property, standing before the President of the United States was a moment of triumph. Lincoln greeted her with respect, and she later described the meeting as a sign that the struggle for freedom was moving forward. Though the war ended with emancipation, Sojourner Truth never mistook victory on paper for victory in reality. She knew the fight had only begun. With the same unshakable resolve, she turned her attention to the next battle, securing equality in the years after slavery's end. The war had ended, the Emancipation Proclamation had been signed, and the Union had claimed victory. But for Sojourner Truth, freedom was only the first step. She knew that the millions who emerged from slavery needed more than words on paper. They needed homes, land, education, and the chance to build lives of dignity. Without these, emancipation risked becoming an empty promise. She threw herself into the work of Reconstruction, traveling across the country to speak for the rights of freed people. One of her fiercest campaigns was for land. She argued that freedom without land left black families dependent on the very people who had once enslaved them. Give them land, she urged, and they can build for themselves. Though her calls for land reform were ignored by Congress, her voice joined a chorus of leaders demanding that true freedom meant economic independence. Sojourner also spoke tirelessly for women's suffrage, linking the struggle for racial justice with the struggle for gender equality. In crowded halls and small churches alike, she thundered against hypocrisy. She reminded Americans that the same nation which had fought a bloody war over liberty still denied half its citizens the right to vote. Her words were met with both applause and anger, but she never backed down. Despite poverty and failing health, she refused to retreat from public life. Into her 60s and 70s, she boarded stagecoaches and trains, carrying her message from town to town. Her towering figure, wrapped in her trademark shawl, became a familiar sight to audiences who came to hear not just a speech, but a living embodiment of resilience. In her final decades, Sojourner Truth remained as steadfast as ever. Though her body weakened, her voice carried the same fire that had once silenced crowds. She continued to speak out against racial injustice, against the spread of segregation, and for the right of women to stand as equals before the law. Wherever she went, she reminded audiences that freedom was not finished business, that America's promise was still unfulfilled. Her life had carried her from the dark cabins of slavery to the halls of power, where she had stood before presidents and challenged the conscience of a nation. Yet, she never allowed fame to soften her resolve. She lived simply, often struggling with poverty, but always giving her time and her strength to the causes she believed in. In 1883, at the age of 86, Sojourner Truth passed away in Battle Creek, Michigan. Her funeral drew crowds who came not only to mourn, but to celebrate a life that had defied every barrier. She was laid to rest as more than a former slave, more than a speaker, more than a woman. She was remembered as a warrior of truth, a mother of freedom, and a prophet whose words echoed long after her passing. Her legacy did not end with her burial. Generations of activists, from the suffragists to the civil rights leaders of the 20th century, carried her name and her words as a banner. "Ain't I a woman?" still resounds as one of the most powerful questions ever asked, a challenge to inequality in every form. Sojourner Truth's life remains a beacon, proving that even those born in chains can rise to shape the destiny of nations.